For the sake of all beings, wisdom, compassion, non-clinging awareness. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Are there any questions or observations? And I'm particularly interested in if there have been any deepenings of understanding as to what actually is ease and what actually is alertness, discernment, inquiry. So any observations in any of those categories or other categories?
Out of an experience of struggle in meditation and in hindsight seeing that I was attempting to get somewhere other than where I was, invoking an attitude of gentleness, which is a real guiding light for me. And remembering that in the background there was sort of this fugue playing of the Bodhisattva path is cosmically long, and remembering that any path is walked one step at a time. And magically remembering the beauty of the Bodhisattva vow that it sort of beckons me. It may be huge, but it's glorious in its own right. And vowing that vow afresh. I'm encouraged to continue. And eventually, sort of like a bubble of methane sort of coming up from the depths of the swamp, arises a question, what is effort? And I think I judge myself sometimes lacking in effort. So what is this effort that I may or may not manifest? And such a question is a real gift too.
And the ability to question long-held assumptions that we didn't even realize we were assuming is something miraculous and special. You could describe the entire path, in one sense, as a path of becoming more cognizant of assumptions that we use in the process of constructing meaning in our living experience. And if you don't recognize these, there's some really big ones, and when I say big, I don't mean that they're big and gripping for the individual, but I mean the bigness of them is a reflection of our kind of general ambience of them. So, we live in a culture where effort means something, like you kind of make effort, you strive to awaken for the sake of all beings, or you strive to better yourself, or you strive to help the homeless people, or we live in a culture where, making that kind of effort, making efforts to get your way through your university studies, this is considered to be on the side of noble and good, right? And no effort smacks of laziness or just kind of wishful thinking, well, it'll just happen, hopefully. Right? And so because this is so deeply part and parcel of our culture, people rarely feel inspired to go, like you just said, well, you know, what do I mean by effort? What actually is effort? And it's not a matter of going, I'm going to get rid of my assumptions, because every moment of perception, every moment of cognition is a revelation of assumptions. We don't operate without assumptions, right? So the idea that you're going to get rid of your assumptions and live in the real world, not just assumed thing, is another assumption, right? But what we could do is we could become more cognizant and more translucent in our assumptions, right? And in the process we might be able to have a little bit more sense of involvement in agreeing to use them when it's useful, and not being compelled to use it when it's not useful. Right? So there's a kind of a freedom that starts to come there. I mean, the Buddha said, I too use concepts, assumptions. There's an assumption in every concept, right? But I'm not fooled thereby. I'm not fooled by it. So most people use concepts and are utterly bamboozled by it. That's the only difference. The difference between the Buddha and the non-Buddha. It's not they're using concepts or working with assumptions, these kinds of things, or not. It's whether they're fooled thereby. Right? And you know, the first meaningful movement in the direction, I think, of not being fooled thereby is starting to feel a kind of vividness and enthusiasm to look into it, not cynically, not dismissively, but like, what is this? Not compulsively even. You know, it's not like, I have to look into this in order to deal with it. It's like, effort. We've been talking about this all my life. I've been participating in this all my life. And all of a sudden, you know, bringing a quality and aptitude of wide open inquiry, interest into this without knowing where it's going seems to be a really valuable thing to do. That's juicy. That's a discovery. I mean, for ourselves, it's not an objective discovery that's worth doing. You should do this. It's more like a subject discovery that when this is worth doing, I say to myself, you know, I know to myself, and I know it because I'm enlivened by it. And, yeah, wonderful.
This is a mix of thinking and things that were arising a little, particularly when I do the yoga refuge. So in regard to the profoundly nourishing ease, so in regard to the refuge, you touched on taking refuge in all sorts of places, and one of them you specifically did mention was the fridge. I can relate to that. And so nourishment, and it's in the precepts. So so there's an expression that if I'm looking for the deep satisfaction, it's a spiritual solution. I don't need food. It's a spiritual solution. So spiritual's a word I can't find. I haven't seen it.
In this text? No. And you don't hear me use it that often. I do use it occasionally, but not too often.
Yes, and I don't hear it. And I'm interested in... and that's a big word out there. People said to me,
close friends, "Oh, you'll be so holy after 3 weeks retreat." And
they wish.
yeah, they wish. Yeah. So, so in regard to compulsion and addiction and not being enough, not having enough, so profoundly nourishing ease. So, for example, if I'm feeling in this way, mentally or emotionally or physically, not enough, this is disease, then I, for example, do my yoga practice in the refuges, and before and after I feel more profoundly nourished and more at ease.
Mm-hmm.
So my thinking was, so there's this is the spiritual solution, but you don't use those words, and I was curious to ask you about that, but also to, so profoundly nourishing ease, this is as good as it gets. This is enough.
Now.
Now.
This is as good as it gets now.
Right.
Which isn't to say, like, we're not keeping it open, but I may want more later. That's not what the now is. The now is a profound recognition that there's only now. Right? And it's a kind of a celebration of that. Right? This is enough now. Right? And which kind of leaves the door open for there to be something else later, which in hindsight, looking back, you say, oh, that wasn't enough. But that's irrelevant. That's not the case. You don't live in that. In a sense, you could live along and you could have a sense of feeling profoundly nourished. And then you die for, natural causes, make a nice little story, right? And nobody knew that if you hadn't died then but lived another 10 years, you would have looked back on that profoundly nourished and realized it was still lacking. And so then, having recognized this, you go, this isn't really nourishment, and you get really, miserable because you're not experiencing the full nourishing that you would live if you'd lived another 10 years and not died. It's silly, totally silly to think that way. So in that sense, it's profoundly nourishing now. This is wonderful, right? One of the reasons why I don't use the word spiritual is because my understanding of that word in the way I hear people using it is that it is a contrast. It's one side of a duality. There's spiritual and there's non-spiritual, or I don't know what you want to call the non-spiritual, material or mundane or samsara or whatever, like different people will fill in a little more about the non-spiritual, how they see it. And so basically I'm simply not interested in one side of a duality. I don't care what side it is. I don't have any interest in it, right? I'm interested in integration, in balance. And what we're talking about is neither spiritual nor non-spiritual, right? If we mean by spiritual a fully integrated view, then I could easily use the word spiritual. I don't have any problem with it, right? But I think a lot of people don't. A lot of people say I'm a spiritual being, and they're critical of, say, atheists or something, or agnostics, or beings of a different religion or a different tradition. And to me, I go, what kind of integrated state is that? That's not even. They say it's spiritual, but it's not spiritual. And the spiritual I call spiritual, hardly anybody recognizes. So I don't bother with the word. It's too loaded. I like using the word God. I use it occasionally, right? It kind of means something to me in a deep way, right? Because in a sense it resonates poetic allusions to profundity, which have gone through my being since my aunt took me to High Mass in a big Catholic church in Montreal when I was, like somewhere between 3 and 4 years old, and I heard God speak, right? And I was just totally blasted by it, right? And I found out later, I realized later, right, that in as part of the Mass, there's this kind of place where the priest would, it was in Latin, it was a high Mass in Latin, before they did everything, and so you couldn't understand any of the words, but it's very ceremonious and everything, and so he's chanting away, and it's kind of obvious he's praying to God. And then there would be this pause, and the organ, right, with very deep tones that were so deep, this huge organ in this church, would, boom, 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 and that was God speaking, and I was like, right? And then the priest would go, right? I mean, I'm a Catholic. There's nothing else in the universe worth doing, right? Save me, right? So I had a sense from the very beginning, the kind of the word, if you like, was the juicy one, which worked. But I don't use it very much because my private use of the word spiritual, if nobody else or hardly anybody else uses it the way I mean, then there's no point in using it because it doesn't communicate. And the same with God. So that's spiritual. But the sense I suspect you are talking about by spiritual is this integrated wholeness quality, right? This is more of that. It's not just one side of a duality. If it is one side of the duality, and you don't want to go back into that unholy, after this 3 weeks of increasing accelerated holiness and spiritualness, right? There's no way you're going back to those friends who were living in that less than spiritual domain, right? Then I would like to suggest that it would be, in the name of Dharma, in the spirit of Dharma, it would be an incredible, amazing thing to discover in here some assumption that would be juicy to explore, right? Because it just doesn't work, right? Straddling this kind of duality. Right? And so, then the question of nourishment, this is like this, it would be not an unreasonable way to express the whole path of Dharma is a path of an increasing of the fifth precept. Like recognizing that we all live by nourishment, and aspiring to nourish myself and others in ways that support awakening. And so in the process of doing that, my understanding deepens, and my appreciation of nourishment becomes broader and more refined. At the beginning it's kind of just nourished by edible food. I always thought that was a really weird thing. In Abhidhamma, this goes right back into the Theravadan tradition. They have this term called Kabbalikaro Ahare. Ahare means food or nourishment, nutriment. And Kabbalikaro is referring to the idea of edible. And when we were first introduced to this, it's like, oh, here's another characteristic, edible food. I thought, duh, that's a dumb thing to say. By definition, food is edible. Who ever heard of inedible food? It's not food, And then I read on a little bit further, and I found out other forms of nourishment were feelings and emotions and memories and aspirations, and right? It's interesting. I thought, oh, that's why so edible food, in terms of what you normally find stored in the fridge, is one type of food, right? But then gradually we begin to realize that there are other kinds of food, and you realize that I may have an excellent diet received with a non-excellent mind, and it doesn't nourish me, and there's a case that I read about years ago, and I don't remember the details. I've kind of really muddled the story and simplified it, but some poor little boy had grabbed a container of boiling water, right, when their mother wasn't watching, and drank it. And they so scalded their esophagus and everything in mouth that for quite a long time the child had to be fed by a tube, and they'd put kind of a balanced diet all blended up in the blender through into his stomach. And he gradually was wasting away, and it looked like he was going to die, and they didn't know what to do. And someone had the brilliant idea of asking him what he'd like to eat. I mean, the nutritionists, everyone has got a balanced diet, we've got this and that. No, he shouldn't be wasting away. It doesn't make sense, right? And he managed to communicate that what he'd like was a Big Mac. Now, this is not health food. Big Macs, generally, we're not seeing as healthy diet, right? So they thought, well, what have we got to lose? So they got a Big Mac, and they did two things. They put most of it in a blender, shot it down the tube, and then they had this brilliant idea. They put a little bit in his mouth, which he couldn't swallow, but he had the pleasure of the taste. And his entire health turned around, and he started to gain weight, because he wasn't just being nurtured by the elements in the food, the organic this and the natural that, and the correct amount of phosphorus and potassium. He was also being nourished by his pleasure in eating, and maybe the association of being nourished by his mother giving him food, right? It's all these kind of other levels of nourishment without which there wouldn't be nourishment. So it's not just a little thing like that. So actually discovering what nourishes a human being, and then developing the capacity to, first of all, invite the best flow of nourishment into ourselves and others that we can. And then second, this is an even more profound kind of practice, which grows out of the first one, right, is to actually be able to make do with the nourishment we do have and make it good. And so, there's a prayer that we sometimes use, like grace, before eating, and we say, may this food have been prepared in a state of love, and may we feed it, and may we receive it in a state of love. And the thing is you can have crap food received in a state of love, and it will nourish you better than really excellent organic food received in a state of hatred. It'd be really nice to have wonderful food received in wonderful love and cooked with love. You know what I mean? Like, it's just pointing these things out. So in a sense, we're refining and extending and opening our understanding. Eventually this becomes nutriment, and how we nurture ourselves and others is kind of a metaphor for all of life. It's for some people, I mean, this could be their path. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's spiritual or not. Just ground up Big Macs with love. Janet.
Just in terms of discernment, there is there's a kind of enlivening to discover that discernment has a quality of incredible delicateness and sort of refinement. And one of the sort of aspects was being in the forest, and then, Penny drops that it's not a forest, it's a community of individuals. Each plant, each tree, each insect has its own, is its own self. It's very enticing.
that a spiritual experience? I said, is that a spiritual experience? You know, like the real spiritual experiences, to call a real spiritual experience a spiritual experience would be trite. It's not enough. And I don't know that we need to, or perhaps even will ever come up with a successful single name for what we're talking about. You know, it's kind of beyond words and symbols. It's no name product, so to speak.
I was reading the Bodhisattva vow, and I read it's like kindness and interest, and then touch with patience and love, and I went up and I read the line above what you're supposed to do. States of suffering are inexhaustible, and I realized I'd just been skipping past that and going to like, all right, well, what do I do about it?
Yeah.
And I found that a really useful contemplation, I guess, is enough to say. And I'm interested also in being in phenomena or innumerable. For some reason, that one didn't quite have the same clarity for me as these states of suffering are inexhaustible. It's like, oh, states of suffering are inexhaustible. I couldn't quite crack that first line.
Well, I mean, it's just beings and phenomena. I mean, I could just say phenomena and include beings. But some people, I mean, this is supposed to be a help. It's not a text for awakened beings. It's a text for beings in the process of awakening. And so lots of good people say, yeah, but these are not just phenomena. These are living beings. Okay, living beings and phenomena. You know, if you want to make that distinction. Or I could call it, not say any phenomena, and they're all beings, because everything's being what it's being. Okay? But it's just a way of speaking to try to communicate. Are innumerable. They're uncountable. Right? There's no end to them. And you know, in order to find that out, you need to try and count them. Right? So you start off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28,000 million trillion, a Google, right, out there. And then I look around and go, I wonder how I'm doing. You know, you've got that far, you're probably pretty much getting to the end of it. You've pretty much counted them all, right? But in the time it took you to count all that, you look back to where you began, a whole bunch of beings have been born. So you got to add them, and by the time you get those, a whole bunch of beings have been born over there. Like, phenomena is unending, right? So just in all of these are called the four immeasurables. You know, or they're associated with the four immeasurables. It's like, it's unending. It's the suffering is just there. It goes on. It goes on forever, kind of thing. There will always be suffering, right? In the sense of wherever there is a sense of existence, wherever there's a sense of spiritual, there will be suffering. Right? In other words, wherever, it doesn't matter if there's this side and that side, whenever you got the two sides, there's going to be some degree of dissatisfaction. Like in manifestation, there is going to be, in consciousness, there's going to be dissatisfaction. Right? So it's just kind of recognizing that this, in other words, my work to touch difficulties with patience and love is unending. My work to explore the Dharmas deep and thoroughly is unending. My work to meet with beings with kindness and interest is unending. right? And my surrendering into the interbeingness of the mystery is unending, right? Because so it's sort of all of those. It's the same in a way. It's like, but they're hinting at. This could be depressing, right? In the sense, oh God, give me some teaching that promises an end to this, right? I'm going somewhere else. You get enlightenment, right? Here you just got an unending kindness and interest. Oh God, that'll be awful, right? Unending patience and love. Oh God, suffering, right? Unending exploring deeply and thoroughly. Oh God, that was terrible. Unending surrendering into the mystery. Oh, give me a break. So, but actually, it doesn't sound so bad either from a different perspective. But that's a hint at what I'm getting at. And I think, it's when you begin to see that states of suffering are inexhaustible, then when you really see that clearly, then you can completely let go of the task of trying to get rid of suffering. And instead you can embrace it with patience and love. But as long as you think that it's exhaustible, then forget the patience and love. Let's just deal with this suffering, get rid of it all, and then I don't even need the patience and love because there won't be any more suffering. Right? And, I'll just explore the dharmas until I know them all, and then I'll be finished. No, they're innumerable. Right? Well, I'll kind of, meet people with kindness and interest until I've met them all. No, this is forever, right? And so Bodhisattva vow, that's why, it might begin as an aspiration for many, many people. For a smaller number of people, it turns into a kind of, what to call it, a significant, motivating energy in their living, so it becomes a practice, right? It becomes but for some people, it becomes a vow, right? Like they just, in other words, like this is not so when I'm doing a practice, it's kind of still to get it to an end, but there's no end to this. This is a way of living. The way of living itself is glorious. Maybe just the way of living is the realization. This is it. It really short circuits the sadhana. It's fantastic. If you get that, you don't have to bother with the rest of it. So in that sense, it's kind of inviting us into a certain contemplation. But wrestle with it. It's good. Like saying, I don't quite get that. Perfect. Stay with not quite getting it. Right? And be a little bit you ask a question in class when you've got it. Right? Because that'll be disastrous and you need a bit of help. Right? But when you don't quite have it, right, that means I'm still like alive and engaging with it. That's actually the perfect place to be. I would like to say a little bit more about this section, essential practices, because this is huge, right? I'm thinking, I've kind of realized I'm contemplating tweaking the language of this again, because I have a clear sense of what I'm trying to express, and I have a clear sense that when I'm happy with the expression, it's expressing it. But in a situation like this, where I have the opportunity of trying to explain or talk about these things, and it just, I become aware of, there's a part in here which is totally central, which I so assume that I didn't need to say anything, but actually it's not necessarily going to be assumed by everyone else. So maybe I better say it. And so like in the natural flow of whatever's occurring, cultivate a continuity of profoundly nourishing ease, right? Suffused with, and then I'm not sure that this is what I'm going to write, but it'll be something along these lines, suffused with attitudes of serene alertness, with serenely alert, discerning, wide open inquiry. Right? And it's the inquiry part that I want to emphasize. Right? There's this it's not just alert discernment, because you could sort of be alert and discerning in theory without inquiring that much. Right? I mean, I can think of my early days of trying to meditate as a good example of this, and that is that we used to have to hand in written meditation reports once a week, and it was obligatory, right? And so at the time, of course, we were supposed to be our meditation experience, and the teacher was some kind of sacred private little communication channel, and no one else was supposed to know about you're not supposed to talk about your meditation experiences to anybody else. Of course, we all talked about our meditation experiences, kind of look at what are you writing, and massive amounts of comparisons going on, and one of the things that I noticed was that people were having a lot of glorious visions and light and blisses, and that this is what they'd report on, and chakras spinning, and insights and everything, and I had none of that, absolutely none of that. I had boredom, pain in my back, pain in my knee, gas problems, like fidgeting, major doubt about doing any of this. That's mostly what I experienced. Right? And then there was another experience that lots of other people reported, which seemed very, very common, was that people would report that they were struggling to stay awake in their meditation. They'd sort of seem to alternate between these kind of peak experiences and then just, right? And I never went to sleep in my meditation. I was wide awake, having pain in my knee. Right? So I started to kind of look at it, and it's like a need to survive, a need to be successful. I kind of turned it around, and who cares about a mere vision or something like that? Things about wakefulness, right? And I am awake, right? And this is vipassana, right? They're all these samatha kind of experiences. And so I kind of kept myself going with this internal fantasy for a while. And then one day, to my absolute shock and dismay, I was sitting in meditation. I could not stay awake. I was just like narcolepsy. I was kind of like, like drugged, I was just kind of like completely off the plot, and I'd just be drifted away into some incredible daydream fantasy, I was so ashamed of myself. I was so upset, right? I knew I had to confess to the Lama, right? I mean, if I didn't, I would be so untruthful. So I wrote down, I fell asleep in meditation. And Rinpoche, who wasn't Rinpoche then, he was Ananda Bodhi, he looked at it and said, finally. Right? I was so shocked by his response. It's kind of weird. Like I expected him to say, well, try harder, or wake up, or pour some cold water. In those days, if you fell asleep in meditation, what you were told to do was to have an ice cold shower and sit in front of a cold wind, right, with all your clothes wet, and just continue on meditating, try and sleep then. I was macho meditation, right? Yeah, we didn't quite get to the whips, but it had that kind of, it was very, I was a male, right? And I got that. It wasn't years later that I thought that maybe, first of all, not every male would get it, and maybe half the population sort of doesn't necessarily get kind of attracted to this method, but nevertheless, in those days, I didn't think about that. It was me and the Lama kind of thing. And it suddenly dawned on me, somewhere along the line, I was going, what does that mean? When he said, finally. It was beautiful, because it just seeded something in me, which, what does he mean by that? What does that mean? And I went away and I didn't say, what do you mean? I went away and asked myself, what does he mean? What does that mean? What is this all about? And it slowly began to dawn on me that my character was a character of high anxiety and great fear. And that my alertness was this kind of chronic need to be totally in control of what's going on all around me, you know, inside and out, right, in case the monster's going to jump out, the monster, and get me, right? And I realized that falling asleep in meditation was actually indicating a softening of that fear. Hence, he said, finally, right? Kind of gone. Now, this is a long, rather drawn-out story to try and illustrate a situation where you could feel you've got alertness and discernment, but there wasn't really inquiry going on. There was just defensiveness going on, right? And so, although when I looked at this, I mean, in a sense, the serenely nourishing ease was really, I could say, in the natural flowing of whatever is occurring, cultivate a continuity of samatha vipassana. End of story. That's what it's referring to. Right? But I didn't want to use the word samatha or vipassana. I wanted to speak in a language that maybe was more broadly relatable. Plus, a lot of people, I think, have very limited understandings of samatha and vipassana. So profoundly nourishing ease. This is on the side of tranquility, allowingness, supportiveness, presence, right? That quality, profoundly nourishing ease. And serene alertness and vivid discernment. This is kind of the bright, alert, awake, inquiry, engagement. But I didn't say inquiry, but I knew it meant inquiry. Right? But I think I'm thinking to add this, right, in the text, just to make it really absolutely inescapably clear. Right? So we have a sense of kind of inquiry there. So these are the two things. It's kind of samatha, vipassana. And it says nourishing ease suffused with. And for many people, when they meet with samatha and vipassana. Whereas this is samatha suffused with vipassana. Samatha vipassana. I like to talk about it. I think it would be more useful in the Mahamudra tradition. It's as if we talk about samatha vipassana. Right? The two kind of facets of rich, present experiencing. Okay. So that's one little comment that I want to make there. And then in the midst of this abiding, this after all is a presentation of a big view of Dharma. I'm talking about the whole text. It's a Mahayana. Right? It's kind of a vision of Mahayana, the heart of Mahayana. And so, you know, obviously it's associated with Buddhism. We're using Buddhist concepts here. I have this aspiration to, in a sense, present this entire material with not the shred of Buddhist reference. But I'm gradually beginning to accept that I'll never be able to do this because I've got Buddhism going through my bones kind of thing, you know. I can't not put it in there, you know. You can't separate it out, but it could be more on the side of Western science, philosophical presentation, and I'll try that, but for sure certain Buddhist themes will run into it, right? But this is definitely a Buddhist one. And so in the midst of this abiding, deepen your involvement by emphasizing one of the following great themes of Dharma. And the one that you're involved with depends very much on the way you're generally viewing the universe, right? And when we talk about Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna, this is very much, first of all, a Theravadan. It's like a Theravadan, classical Theravadan way of presenting a full mandala of awakening. Right? It goes right back to the most ancient times at the time of the Buddha. And you find it in the Visuddhimagga and so on, like I spoke about the other day. But the emphasis that you find in the form of the teaching is that the teaching is being given very much to monks and nuns, not so much to lay people, right? They're kind of allowed to look in and tacitly, well, you know, but if you were really serious, you'd get ordained and become a monk, right? And when they, for example, they talk about Sila, I mean, I'm realizing that I've talked about Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna because I'm trying to talk about it in a universal sense and almost like present it through the lens of Mahamudra Dzogchen view. But they weren't doing that. Sila was basically an entire teaching on restraint. Right? Restraining yourself from killing, restraining yourself from lying and abusing beings, restraining yourself from taking toxic substances, right? And undertake to train myself not to take the life of any living being, right? And there was a sense of restraint from getting involved with this, right? And this is like actually a really excellent, profound, and deeply meaningful path for someone who is very grossly in the grip of addiction. You know, like, I mean, for example, if the person is, you know, a functional alcoholic, right? That sounds almost like a contradiction, but I mean, like they drink way too much and they have total access to drinking way too much, and they don't have any restraints on drinking way too much. They're a good functional, everything's going for them for their alcoholism, right? And so Sila is like, how can I bring some healthful living into this, right? This is what I'm working with while I'm cultivating ease and discernment as best as I understand it right now, right? Well, what I do is, it's a good idea to kind of restrain from drinking. And so you get some, I remember, you know, there's people come to Buddhism from the West and they have all kinds of, non-Buddhists, right? All kinds of projections, assumptions about what Buddhism is all about. You know, so sometimes people assume that all Buddhists are vegetarian, and then they freak out when they go to the supermarket with a bunch of Tibetan lamas, right? And they fill the shopping cart up with steaks and you know, sides of lamb, or you know, they assume that Buddhists don't use alcohol. And the proof of that, like Uttalawanta Sayadaw, Namgyal Ananda Bodhi's teacher, Namgyal's Burmese teacher, he was so strict for himself on alcohol that he wouldn't even take homeopathic medicines where the thing had been distilled in a little tiniest amount of alcohol. He wouldn't take that, right? Just like totally no alcohol, period, right? And I remember, you know, once Rinpoche used to love to teach by taking social you know, like kind of conventional social situations, you know, Christmas, Easter, St. Patrick's Day, you know, and sort of celebrate them, you know, and it's an excuse to kind of look at certain things. So we're celebrating St. Patrick's Day. This is the bhikkhu. He's a bhikkhu. A bhikkhu, you get it, right? And I've only known him for about 6 months, and I'm going to his house on Palmerston Avenue in Toronto, and I walk in, and it's like a St. Patrick's Day party. Everyone's dressed in green with funny hats and shamrocks and what have you, and it's like part of the de rigueur. I'm thinking, this is a bit weird. Like, I mean, I knew what I wanted. I wanted robes and bald heads and just, you know, quiet, and that was where it was at. And suddenly all this is going on. And there was booze all over the place. Guinness, you know, stout, you know, and Irish whiskies, and you know, you name it. And I was a little bit kind of taken back, but you know, what the heck? I was game for it. This is the path, okay, let's go. And then I observed in the room a conversation going on between the bhikkhu who was standing there and some guy, kind of a new student. And the new student was saying to the bhikkhu with tremendous pride that a drop of alcohol had never passed his lips. And while he was speaking, it was as if he was oblivious to the fact that while he was speaking to Rinpoche was really listening to him and conspicuously pouring a huge head of foam from a Guinness, right, into a large glass. And he's going on about how, well, I've never had. And then Rinpoche, or the bhikkhu, quietly said to this person, that's may that be, or whatever he said, how it started. But he said, if you want to be a student of mine, you will drink this glass down right to the bottom now. Right? Now, so you can imagine, an alcoholic comes for help to the bhikkhu. The bhikkhu's pouring out this great glass of whiskey and says, if you want to be a student of mine, drink this whiskey now. Now, that would be a disaster, right? That disaster for this being, but for that being, it's not the alcohol, it's like where we are with it, right? But in the beginning, it's like sometimes we have an attitude that we have a lot of bad stuff going in my life, habit patterns and so on, and I need to restrain them. This is early stage work, right? Samadhi is actually fundamentally taught as exercises in absorptive concentration. And so, the instructions there in the Visuddhimagga are very much like creating a space, keeping all the distractions out, right? Keep bringing your mind back to the object again and again and again, right? And coming into states of jhana, absorption, technical absorption. That's what it's about. And then the prajna, right, which is like the wisdom aspect. This is very much a kind of study of analysis, analyzing how things are interconnected. We accept the things. We accept that there's alcohol and it's bad and we've got to stop it. We accept that there's a distraction and we have to kind of withdraw from it. We accept that there are objects and we want to see how they're interconnected. We're far away from going, well, how does the sense of an object in a totally dynamic universe even come forth? We're not even asking that question. Right? But sila, samadhi, and prajna, in this very classical, ancient, cultural way of expressing it, can be, for many people, absolutely central, informing kind of framework in which they're doing their practice in the natural flow of whatever's occurring. I'm cultivating profoundly nourishing ease as I'm cultivating restraint, right? Cultivating vivid discernment and interest and so on as I'm cultivating restraint, as I'm cultivating concentration, as I'm cultivating wisdom, right? And that's not to say, a person could, for me, I see my life today as a weaving of sila, samadhi, and prajna, but not in that way I just interpreted it, right? It's not restraint at all. It's wise engagement. It's not just concentration, right? It's samatha vipassana, right? It's not just understanding the interconnectedness of everything. It's wisdom. Prajna is emptiness, right? It's ungraspable. It's unpindownable. The same words, right, but understood at a different level. But I'm just trying to point out that there is a level, just because I interpret it all the time in this big sense. Actually, what we're trying to do here is realize that people might practice with different kind of views of a world in which the practice is taking place. And so this same practice could be valuable for many different people. Right? The sixth parami is very much the practice that lies at the heart of classical Mahayana teaching. All the Prajna Paramita sutras and so on, They rest on the development of the parami, which rests on a good foundation of the sila, samadhi, and prajna. Right? And so it may be that it doesn't mean that we're not restraining still a little bit, and still trying to develop the skills of concentration, and still interested in how things interconnect. But that's not necessarily the primary juice of what we're doing. And maybe the primary juice of what we're doing is working with one or more or all of, or sequentially, or whatever, of the parami. Generosity, this is my work, generosity. Wholesome relating, this is my work, wholesome relating. Patience, right? Skilled use of energy, continuity of caring and inquiry, profound understanding. Right? And so within that, as I am working with this, I'm continuously refining my experience of profoundly nourishing ease, suffused with serene, alert, discerning, open, wide open inquiry. This is a sense like that. And then we have a kind of progressive mastery. I know that some people have a sense they're not really working on the parami, and yet the parami are there, right? But what they're really working on is a kind of progressive mastery of samatha vipassana. And this lies at the heart of Zen Mahamudra Dzogchen, right? This is the kind of primary practice, working face, right? And it's very, very refined compared to the type of concentration and understanding of connectedness that's happening at the earlier stages, right? And it's also characteristic of Tantrayana, right? This kind of, I don't want to say Vajrayana particularly, right? Because, I like to think of these great yanas as being reflections of degrees of maturity in the practitioner, right? So we look at Hinayana, and it's like a kind of smaller, younger, less expanded and enriched and developed way of practicing. And then Mahayana is an enlarged, more matured, right, more developed way of practicing. And then Tantrayana, right, is very much a way of practicing in which there's two aspects of Tantrayana. One is Tantra can refer to continuum, so it was like Tantra is the great continuum, right? But Tantra also can refer to weaving, right? It's kind of like the interweaving of whatever it is you see. Everything's interwoven with everything, and whatever things you see as things, they're interweaving, right? And so you've got a kind of a radical, you've got an opening with Tantrayana, which starts to become radically inclusive, because everything is weaving in through this, right? And hence we can't have spiritual as opposed to non-spiritual, not in Tantrayana, right? And so Zen Mahamudra Dzogchen can be explored without a lot of the tantric looking stuff. And when it's done there, it's kind of really absolute kind of bare bones samatha vipassana, maturing up to full realization, bingo, that's it. Right? It's all inclusive there. Right? But for many people, there may be other refined enhancements, right, that support that. Right? So one of them is called illusory body practice. And this is where we're beginning to, when I talk about translucentizing the universe, that's actually comes under illusory body practice. It's illusory like, it's like you begin to see that the forms that we see are reflections of the way we are seeing. And if the way we are seeing changes, the form that we see changes, right? And so, like what is this dance of phenomena? We start to see this, right? It has a sense of like at that point we say phenomena and not beings. It's just phenomena. Phenomenology is like looking at illusory body practice in a sense, in a Western sense. And then we also have the union of skillful fabrication and effortless naturalness, or generation yoga and completion yoga. This morning I'm not wanting to try to explain these things in detail. If we were to, each one of these is a very complete path, and we could spend a long time exploring them to understand them. But I'm just saying, like, and the last one is Guru Yoga, you know, and in a way, this is a kind of the last three: illusory body, generation, completion, or skillful fabrication, effortless naturalness, and Guru Yoga are classic Tantrayana, associated classically with Tantrayana, right? And Guru Yoga, by time you could almost take this in a way as increasing capacity of embrace, understanding, and refined understanding, right? And so, you know, although Guru Yoga obviously can be taught and understood at a very crude level, you know, like sort of serving the Guru and helping the Guru and being devoted to the Lama and these kinds of things, that's not the most refined final understanding of Guru Yoga. And right, since pure awareness of nowness is the real Guru, is the real Buddha, in openness and contentment I find the Lama, the Guru, in my heart. When we understand this unending natural mind is the very nature of the Lama, then there's no need for attached grasping or weeping prayers or artificial complaints. By simply resting in this unborn, open, natural state, we attain spontaneous liberation of whatever arises. Right? And this is Guru Yoga, right? When in a sense we have found ourselves in an attitude of relationship to everything in the universe of our experience, with a sense of valuing and reverencing and appreciating and learning from, then everything's been transformed into Guru. That's the kind of the culmination of Guru Yoga. And it's also because I realize that I'm learning from it, and yet the it that I'm learning from is none other than the processing of me in the act of learning, right? And so, you know, I could say, well, I'm the Guru. I'm my own Guru, right? But that's usually when people say that, that's not actually an expression of the most refined level of understanding of Guru Yoga. I think if you really get that, you'd never say it. But it's there, you know, in a sense, because it's seamless. Like the process that's giving rise to this universe that I'm learning from is inseparable from the process that I call me. And so just as I don't bother with spiritual because it doesn't sort of communicate, well, I don't even bother with me because it doesn't communicate, and I don't bother with other because it doesn't communicate when you get to this. Okay? And so there's a sense that you may be, think of these 6 that are suggested here. We could have had 60, right? But these are really big, gross areas within Buddhist schools, which are commonly worked on. You know, like people will really get their spiritual teeth into it, right, for years on end, maybe even devote a major part of a life to working on any one of these, right? So in the midst of abiding in a natural flow of whatever's occurring and cultivating profoundly nourishing ease, suffused with an attitude of serene, alert, discerning, wide-open inquiry, right? Whether sitting, standing, lying down, or walking, allowing everything to rest in its own place, in other words, to rest in the unique, ever-fresh fullness and vastness of being and becoming that it is, in the midst of abiding like this, depending on what feels most appropriate in your life, your passion, your engagement, your involvement, deepen this involvement by emphasizing one of the following great themes of Dharma practice. Right? And so you could look at this as kind of essential practice. Right? It's not just, the essential practice is not so simple to be able to say, oh, just focus on the tip of your nose and follow your breath there and don't wander. That's the essential practice. Or this is the essential practice. So the essential practice, there's, first of all, I guess we have to say essential practices, and then we have to say essential praxis, and then we begin to see that there's a, like when you're really in a state of deep inquiry, you know, a sense of fresh question that you never thought of asking before is coming up in a sense of greater solidity than ever before, which sounds rather contradictory because you think that the question comes up when you're feeling less solid, right? And I'm confident, like, out of it, right? And this is what's working. This is this practice. And in the midst of this, relaxing and alerting and inquiring and sila, samadhi, prajna-ing and samatha vipassana-ing, and you know, you don't have to do these things, right? It's just that you may, if you're drawn to classical Buddhist teachings, right, these things are happening. But the key here is that while you're doing Chenrezig, you're cultivating profoundly nourishing ease and so forth, right? While you're doing vipassana, you're doing this. While you're cultivating generosity, you're doing this. While you're cultivating generation stage or completion stage, you're doing this. While you're cultivating guru yoga, you're doing this. Right? That's really what it's trying to say. Right? While you're washing the dishes, while you're being spiritual, while you're not being spiritual, you're doing this. That's to be spiritual. And that's really what I wanted to just kind of nudge this morning. Any little clarification we can make at all on what I've just said? It's also recognizing that in the path of Sadhana, there's a character in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and you know, in a sense, he's like the in the hunting of the snark, the guy with no name was the guy who found the snark, right? You know, he sort of he answered to, he was particularly known for all the baggage he left behind on the beach, and he answered to thingamajig and whatchamacallit and whoever, right? Because he didn't really seem to have a name, and he kept on forgetting all his baggage, right? And everybody else, you know, there was the candle maker and the lace maker and the beaver and, you know, all these different characters who go hunting the snark, and they've all got the talents and abilities and so on, but this guy hadn't, you know, seemed to have no talent except the talent to just kind of mindlessly walk on, right? And at the very end, you know, this guy who answers to thingamajig and whatchamacallit is last seen sort of racing over the horizon. I've seen the snark, it's a, and then the last thing you hear, it's a boo, and it's just the end. And so in the Avatamsaka Sutra, Sadhana is a bit like that character, right? Not really. I mean, he's got all kinds of qualities and so on. It's a bit of a stretch to compare the Avatamsaka with the hunting of the snark. But you know, there's a sense, he's the one who realizes the glorious abode of Samantabhadra, right? With a little help from his friends, right? And you know, and he's walking this path, and he's cultivating these, right? We're on this journey, and you're kind of, he's working at this, and he goes to a teacher, and he, asks a question. The question's constantly like, how is it possible for beings to wake up to kind of a knowledge of innumerable dharmas? How is it possible to have immeasurable this, or what does it actually mean for a bodhisattva to be present with and for everyone, right? And all the teachers that he asks, he starts off, the first teacher, right, doesn't answer his question. It's a kind of strange dialogue. He comes out with this very clear question, and then the teacher proceeds to just natter on about his own experiences, not about anything to do with the question. And he said, well, I have found, and then would speak from his experience. And you realize, wow, is this guy ever amazingly awake? He's got like massive breadth of understanding and mastery of Dharma. It's the first teacher. And then, at the very end of page after page, many, many pages of this teacher going on about sharing his experience, he said, but as far as your question goes, you should actually go and see so-and-so. He could give you a much better answer. So sends him off to the next teacher. And then Sadhana comes out and asks the question again. Each time he rephrases it, the question begins to transform across the 50 teachers. His question, his expression, his way of understanding his question enriches and transforms and refines as he goes along. And the same thing happens. The next teacher starts to talk about, well, I have found, and speaks from this, right? And all of a sudden, this second teacher makes the first teacher look like little Mickey Mouse, right? Compared to Mighty Mouse, it was like, wow, what a massive, mega expansion of understanding, which we, as the reader of the Avatamsaka Sutra, you go, if the first time through, you go, wow, that's awesome. You can just about get it. It's getting so big, but as far as your question goes, you should go off and see so and so. And Sadhana goes on a journey of visiting 50 teachers. Each one's the same. Each one is a massive explosion of breadth and capacity to embrace a kind of infinitely creative universe. And the power, if you like, of the Avatamsaka Sutra is part of it, is that the teachers that he goes to are from every conceivable walk of life. He goes to monks and nuns and saints and jazz musicians and businessmen and homeless people and prostitutes and dakinis and, sort of like beings who obviously live in a human world, and then also mythical beings who you can hardly imagine. That's what I meant by dakini, like, kind of imagined zone and so on. And each one is having a more and more, probably nearly 50%, is very close, right, of all these teachers are female, right? It's like the balance is fantastic between kind of professional awakening person and kind of amateur, between male and female, between some people, well, I was educated at Oxford and I did this, and then I got my PhD, I got my fourth PhD there, and then I went to Banarasi and I studied there and I became a master of Tantra, and I did this and I mastered all these texts and this text and this text. There was one guy like that, this super duper scholar, right? And then there's, somebody else who hadn't learned to read. You know what I mean? It's like, so you got this sense, slowly the penny starts to drop, that these kind of images you have of how an awakened being should be start to fall apart, and you begin to say, well, what do I really mean by awakening? And yet the one thing that does happen is each one is like an inconceivable expansion of understanding, and then gradually the understanding is so expanded that we, the readers, can't really discern any further expansion of understanding. And the expansion becomes more and more an expansion of capacity to skillfully engage in relationship with others in ways that support them. And so a really kind of crude example is the very first stage of the Bodhisattva is that being is supposed to be able to kind of support 100 beings and liberate 100 beings and uplift 100 beings and so on. And there's some texts that say this, and then the second step goes to 1,000, and then it goes to 10,000, and then it goes to 1,000,000, and then it goes to 10 million. By the time you get to 50, right, there's one guy who's, I'm trying to it's very difficult to illustrate like how large my vision has become, but I want you to imagine, and it goes something like, imagine all the grains of sand in the Ganges River. Then imagine, right, as many Ganges rivers as there are grains of sand in one Ganges river. And then imagine all the grains of sand that are in all those Ganges rivers. And then imagine there's many Ganges rivers as all those grains of sand. And then you get bored with it because it goes on for 3 pages. And what's quite astonishing is that at a time when, 24 was one of the largest numbers that we knew about in Europe, right? In China, in 600 AD, they were talking about cosmic numbers, like the number of atoms in the universe. I mean, just to conceive of such immensity, it's just like out of sight in those days. So you get a sense of expansion of wisdom and compassion, right? Until eventually he's still having this sense, he's still got this kind of fixed idea that he wants to be in the presence of Samantabhadra, right? And he finally ends up with Manjushri, who he started with, and Manjushri gives him kind of a little bit of a nudge in a direction, and then just suddenly, bang, right? Everything is the abode of Samantabhadra, right? He didn't get there, he just is there, and a kind of thing. So this sense of what's the essential practice that Sadhana was working with? This is the essential practice. He didn't pray. His essential practice wasn't visualizing a heavenly realm and then imagining himself getting there. It was in a sense, very ordinary. And what it was that each teacher would talk about their own experience. And then there's this beautiful section where it would go on maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs in the chapter, and then with that teacher, and then the story of the next teacher would pick up with that, and so Sadhana wandered on searching for such and such a person, and while he was doing that, he's contemplating what might it mean to live this way, and he's in a sense seeing his own experience through the lens of possibility, right? That this might be possible, until eventually, right, this becomes his way of operating. And then in that way of operating, he could meet with some other, in a sense, even larger vision, would go, wow. And each one is one way of speaking about it. It's like the reason why you go, whoa, is you go, oh yeah, I had these assumptions, right? And in the letting go of that assumption, no, now I have whoa, and then you meet with another teacher, right? And it's enough for most human beings to get on with. The idea of being kind of worried that you're not going to be able to sort of do this journey is sort of inconsequential. The journey is glorious. And the amazing thing is that it turns out that Samantabhadra, when you get to the end, was actually there right at the beginning in the Avatamsaka, right? And at the end he realizes there's never been a time when he's not been dwelling in the glorious abode of Samantabhadra, but he didn't realize it then, right? So that's essential practices, and tomorrow, right, we kind of nudge towards this next section. In a way, that section still can resonate every school of Buddhism, right? Up until here, it's resonating that. When we start going a little bit further, it starts, you have to be quite interpretive to find this in every school of Buddhism. You start finding it more in Tantrayana and Vajrayana. I don't speak of Vajrayana so much as a vehicle of maturity, strangely enough, because if I was to follow a consistency of the way I'm referring to Hinayana, Mahayana, and Tantrayana, and Vajrayana, Vajrayana in a sense means kind of unshakable solidity in completion, in total realization. So it's no longer a vehicle. It isn't a vehicle. It's the final realization, right? So, actually, Tibetan Buddhism, there are practitioners within Tibetan Buddhism who are expressions of Vajrayana, but most practitioners within Tibetan Buddhism are expressions of degrees of Mahayana, Tantrayana, Hinayana as well. When we're there, very much concerned with our progress or our doing it right or something like that, right? And Vajrayana we should just get rid of Vajra. Get rid of Yana, right? And just say Vajra, right? Good. Sarva Mangalam.